Welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program's Seminar Series podcast at the Harvard Kennedy School.
So we have got a line in the back of the room, but I think I'm going to go ahead and start us, if that's okay. My name is Hannah Riley Bowles. I'm a research director here at the Women in Public Policy Program. Sorry to dive in. Is that all right if I go ahead? Okay, great. So here at WAP, we are committed to closing gender gaps in the areas of economic opportunity, political participation, health, and education. And one, that's a very ambitious agenda, and we attempt to contribute to it in many ways, but one way is really through this seminar, which has been a space for student, faculty, staff, dialogue, but also outreach around some of the leading ideas related to gender and public policy that are out there in the research community. We have now, I have it, do I have in my notes? Yeah. WAP's podcast, so these talks are all being broadcast through podcasts, and I will now start formally welcoming our podcast community that has downloaded our seminars over 11,000 times. So we think we're sitting in a small seminar room, but we're really having a much broader conversation, which is very exciting. I bet Terry's got a lot of So I have the honor today to introduce Mary Brinton. She is the Reischauer Institute Professor of Sociology, and she's the chair of the Sociology Department here at Harvard. Mary is a world-renowned sociologist, comparativist, studying gender inequality and labor markets. And we learn something every time you come, so we're thrilled. We're looking forward to your talk. Thank you very much. Maybe join me again.
It's always a great pleasure to come over here and speak to a different audience. And as department chair, I don't have much time for research, so it's a double pleasure to be able to take an hour and a half and just talk about research. I'm going to present this paper, which is co-authored with a graduate student in our department, Carly Knight. And Carly is really the technician on this paper in all of the good senses of the word. This is quite a technical paper, so I'm just warning you that if you have technical questions, I may just have to send you the paper because Carly is the real brains behind that part of it. But we worked together because Carly is also a comparativist. She's more of a political sociologist. And as Hannah said, I work on gender inequality and labor markets. And we started talking about gender egalitarianism and how much gender egalitarian thought is really increasing or stalling or whatever, and we decided to work together on this paper on Europe. The paper, I'm happy to say, has been accepted in the American Journal of Sociology, and it is such a meaty, long paper that we actually have to trim it for the American Journal of Sociology, which Carly's in the middle of doing right now. We actually have too many analyses in the paper, but that's because of her brilliance, and she's actually the first author on the paper. And she's in Chicago today, so she couldn't come with me to field technical questions. But I think we have, hopefully, a lot of interesting theoretical questions and empirical results, which I'll be explaining to you. So, first of all, we know that, of course, there's been tremendous change in women's labor force participation and the rise of gender egalitarian attitudes in the post-industrial world. But we also know that from the early to mid-1990s on, there's been a lot of discussion about how the gender role revolution has really stalled. So if we look at a lot of indicators, such as the male-female wage gap, we see that the pace of change has really slowed down in the narrowing of the male-female wage gap since, again, the early to mid-90s. There's also a real slowdown in the decline of occupational sex segregation. So labor forces in every European and North American and East Asian country remain highly, highly segregated occupationally by sex. There's very little movement of men into traditionally female occupations. Most of the decline of occupational sex segregation in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s was really women moving into male, so-called male-dominated occupations, because women were gaining greater human capital and because men's work tends to pay more, so it's very appealing for women to try to enter it, and of course it tends to be higher prestige. Very little movement of men into traditionally female occupations. And also, as we all know probably from personal experience, there's been a very slow pace of change in gender roles in the household. So in the US, men put in slightly more housework time than they used to and more childcare time. But women are still working very long hours in the market and at home. There's also been pretty perceptible slowing in a change in gender role attitudes towards egalitarianism. So it's a big puzzle in the gender inequality literature why we've seen this slowdown, and a lot of people are trying to write about it. So what Carly and I decided to do was to look, we generally don't study attitudes, she and I, but we decided to look at how ideologies are changing. And we know that there's been a big decline in beliefs based on male primacy. So the belief that men are better for women than women. The belief that men are just more qualified overall, right, for executive jobs and so forth than women. There's been a very noticeable decline in this belief that men are just overall better. But there's been also, together with that, and quite distinct from it, there's been not such a decline in beliefs that men and women are really different from each other, you know, or have different traits, gender essentialism, right? So these are really quite different dimensions, and a lot of this is talked about really beautifully in a book that's getting, I guess, a little bit old now, but Charles and Grusky, Occupational Ghettos, which is about occupational sex segregation in post-industrial countries, Maria Charles and David Grusky. But anyway, they make this distinction between gender essentialism and male primacy. And gender essentialism is not necessarily antithetical to egalitarian beliefs. You know, we can believe that men and women have some differences in sort of their inherent traits and capabilities, but they're equal, right? That's a possibility. That's a theoretical possibility. So Carly and I, in our work, are pulling apart these different dimensions. Because modernization theory, which I shouldn't use as a straw person, but I am going to kind of use it as a straw person, you know, really has this extraordinarily optimistic view that societies will move from the, quote, traditional to the modern, and that includes egalitarianism. And that really implies quite a unilineal change, unilinear, I put here. So that there are two poles. There are traditional gender role attitudes, and there are modern or egalitarian ones. And we think that's just really faulty, because that doesn't accommodate for these ideas about gender essentialism and how they may be compatible to some extent with egalitarianism. And we also feel that that kind of unilinear logic leaves out another very important dimension, which is sort of the should of, or have to, or ought to of gender roles. So we make a distinction between ideologies that say, well, men and women should do the following, and ideologies that particularly say, for women, they have choices. I mean, men don't usually have choices in any of these ideologies. Men work, and you know, it's really great if they contribute to the household in other ways besides income, right? If they do household work and childcare. But there is a sort of array of viewpoints about what women should do. Should women, to be good feminists, work full-time? Or not? Or can a woman be a feminist, to put it crudely, can a woman be a feminist and choose to be a stay-at-home mom, right? So there are varieties of feminism. And these, we think, have a lot to do with whether, people regard women as having valid choices or things that they really have to do. To be a feminist, you have to participate in the labor market and do whatever you need to do at home. So these two dimensions then are normative component of choice or have to, and gender essentialism. So first of all, we ask, the very basic question. It's kind of a straw person question because we know the answer to it. Are traditional or so-called male breadwinner, female caregiver gender role attitudes declining everywhere in the post-industrial world? And the answer is yes, they are. The real question is what's replacing them? Is it this straightforward gender egalitarian position that we think of where men and women both do everything and are kind of replicants of each other, that kind of egalitarianism? Or are there other kinds of egalitarianism, which is what we argue and try to measure? So I'm going to zoom to the data and methods. I want to leave plenty of time for conversation and discussion because I anticipate that there'll be quite a lot. If not, I can just keep talking. Yeah, Hannah.
Is it okay? Did you say you're okay open to questions?
Yeah.
So are you setting up an argument for a kind of pseudo-egalitarianism?
No, we identify three kinds of egalitarianism. We believe that these are egalitarianisms. So we wouldn't say pseudo.
Okay.
Yeah, but we call them, we have adjectives to describe
Okay.
the different kinds.
So you're genuine egalitarian.
Pardon?
Yeah, I get you. Thank you.
We're going to identify three types. Now, this is a sadness for me since I work on East Asia, and this is a paper entirely on Europe. I have another paper, I can talk about East Asia a little bit along these lines, but my other paper that includes East Asia, we had to make some data compromises, and Carly is not into data and measurement compromises, so we had to, she insisted that we stick to the high quality data that we have for 17 European countries. So we used the World Values Survey and then European Values Survey, which has the same questions, fortunately, for countries. And we're looking over a 20-year period, not quite up to the present, but 1990 to 2010. And what we did was to take all the items in the World Values Survey and the European Values Survey that really have to do with men's and women's roles in the labor market and in the family. Now, there are lots of other gender role attitude questions about, do you think women should occupy more political positions and so forth. We didn't take those. Ours are really focused on this work and family set of concerns, partly because a lot of the gender role attitude literature recognizes, at least pays lip service to the fact that there are a lot of different dimensions that are being captured. Some people have chosen to just look at statements that have to do with the home, women's role in the home. And then others say, okay, and actually those people often say, well, we're going to do that. We're going to look at those attitude items, and we'll look at the attitude items that have to do with women's labor market roles and distinguish between those two. We don't want to do that. We want to look at the intersection of these. But we're not so concerned in this paper about other gender role attitudes, such as, do you think we should have a woman president, and so forth. So it's really work and family. So first of all, this is and unfortunately, I should also say, up until very, very recently, in the gender role attitude data, there's almost nothing about what men should do. It's all about what women should and shouldn't do, which is a problem because, we want to be analyzing what people think about men's roles too, but there's a real asymmetry here, and it's only very recently that some of the attitude surveys have started talking more about men. But as you'll see, most of these have to do with women. A working mother can establish just as warm and secure a relationship with her children as a mother who does not work. Being a housewife is just as fulfilling as working for pay. A lot of assumptions built into that, personal fulfillment. Both husband and wife should contribute to household income. A job is all right, but what most women really want is a home and children. Having a job is the best way for a woman to be an independent person, and when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. So very breadwinner, oriented statement. And so the World Values Survey and the European Values Survey ask individuals in different countries to, as I put here, indicate their strength of agreement or disagreement on a Likert scale with each of these attitudes and a bunch of other attitudes that we're not analyzing here.
Mary, do you know anything about how these questions, or these, and not even questions, and kind of comments, observations came about? And maybe you don't. I mean, you just use what they have. But it's just, it's just interesting that it's just an interesting question. Right? Should we use stereotypical questions, kind of affirming the stereotypes? And I think they go back and forth. So
They
mostly
do.
stereotype.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
once in a while, they'd say, having a job is the best way for a woman to be an independent person, which is probably counter-stereotypical.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was just wondering
Husband
what
and wife should
thought went
contribute
into how we framed these comments.
I know. Some of these questions are, well, I haven't shown some of the most problematic ones. We didn't do some of the most problematic. The one, my favorite is, let me see if I can remember. It's in the World Values Survey. And it's interpreted entirely different in Northern Europe than in North America. It has to do with, Sienna, if you remember the question, you can tell me. It's about single mothers, I think. And it's read totally different in countries that have very high rates of cohabitation
Yes.
and those that don't. So, I don't know. These have been used in the World Values Survey over many, many
Yes.
ways.
And of course, we don't want them to change, right?
And we don't want them to
Trouble
change, so
because
we're kind of stuck with
Yes.
them. Exactly.
So that in essence gets to my comment. But very interesting to see how it's changed over time, which I know you'll walk us through. But the survey definitely sets up very clearly that women's status is in question and to some extent in jeopardy and is worth scrutinizing. And as you put sort of the flip of this out before, that men's status is by definition.
Yeah.
That their maleness, according to the survey, comes with position in society which doesn't need to be questioned or in conflict.
Yeah. And, that probably the World Values Survey goes back to the late 80s, or around 1990. And
It would be very interesting to define a second survey if one were able to do it with the same level of coverage over time, that the questions didn't lead the audience by
Into
definition
it,
to have those questions around female status, but if gender became subsumed more into attributes, and there was a way of, in essence, separating out gender from the question.
what would be an example?
Are you comfortable with the notion that all family members have an equal right to participation in wage?
Yeah.
But in essence, to take us several steps beyond the notion that gender defines behaviors, as
Right.
opposed to behaviors exist in and of themselves and don't have to be attached to gender to have validity.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as I said, some of the more recent surveys, the European Values Surveys, have added questions. And actually, maybe I'll come back to that later, because in Carly's thoroughness, we did look at some recent surveys, and I can tell you I can give you some results, but since they're not the main results, I'll save that till later and we can talk about them. But there are some new questions in European Values Survey that addresses men's role.
just one more thought. I mean, if you go back to those questions, if you just replace woman with men, I mean, you just notice how,
Yeah.
you know, we really don't have those questions for men. Like, what would be the equivalent? Is that about, you know, do you expect men to be still breadwinners? You know, what do men need for their identity? You know, but this idea of working father can establish just as
I know.
important secure relationship with his children as a father who does not work. I love
Or
it.
being
I mean, if you
being a
just
house
play with
husband
that.
is just as fulfilling as working for pay. There are questions that have to do more with marriage, so, and those are asked in a gender symmetrical way. So, and so we didn't include the marriage question here, but you know, it's important for women to marry in order to have a fulfilling life. And then there's a question for men too. It's important for men to marry. But that doesn't really so much have to do with, again, the sort of balance between work and home. So we tried to focus only on those, and indeed there weren't any for men. There really aren't. This one is interesting because it can be interpreted in many ways. But anyway, you'll see what we found. So we have the two main hypotheses that we're not going to see this binary between traditionalism on the one hand and one kind of egalitarianism on the other, you know, as in two poles of a continuum, but instead that we are expecting to find that individuals in the societies we're looking at are going to cluster into different groups. And these groups we're theoretically predicting are, of course, going to have to do with gender egalitarianism, gender equality, but also with essentialism. You know, women do this because they're women, and the normative requirement that, you know, you should do this or not. And we only expect to see that, for sure, traditionalism has declined in all countries. But we don't expect to see necessarily that the same type of egalitarianism or types of egalitarianism are, you know, sprouting up in all different countries. And I'm going to not show you the results for all 17 countries because I can predict what will happen if I do. There'll be a question on Austria, and a question on France, and a question on Germany, and a question on Sweden, and so forth. So I'm going to only show you results from a few countries, because otherwise we'll talk all day about each country, which would be very interesting, but we'll run out of time. So what we used was an exploratory, i.e. inductive method, latent class analysis, which really groups individuals together into clusters that seem to make sense on these 7 attitude items. So it's completely inductive. It's not, theoretically motivated. And what you do is look for the most parsimonious solution. So it could be a 2-class solution, or a 3-class solution, or a 5-class solution, latent class or group. And the most parsimonious solution we found was a 4-class solution. So now I'm going to go through the gender role attitude classes. Well, lo and behold, there is something called traditional attitudes, right? And it's very much what you would think. The others I'm going to give you some greater description of because they're much less obvious, because they are variants of egalitarianism, types of egalitarianism. I just have to get my cheat sheet on this so I can explain them well. The second one, in a different paper, I've called this full egalitarian. But this is what most of us would think of as being an egalitarian, straight egalitarian position. So this is most closely associated with thinking of gender egalitarianism in the following way. Men and women should both work and contribute to family income. Having a job is the best way for a woman to be independent. This group scores high on that. Working mothers can indeed establish just as close a relationship with their children as non-working mothers. Strong disagreement that being a housewife is as fulfilling as working for pay. So it very much emphasizes men's and women's, joint participation in the labor market, and rejects attitudes that are much more gender essentialist, having to do with women's place in the home. Very strong disagreement in this class, for instance, that men have more right to a job than women in times of economic recession. So basically, what the technique does, latent class analysis, is it looks at probabilities, the probability that you have a belief in on each of these 7 attitudes, and again forms clusters of individuals. And then you have to make sense as the analyst out of the clusters. And conceivably they could be nonsensical clusters. So you have to figure out, are these really valid? And we did a lot of checks for that later in the paper. We believed them, but we wanted to really feel like we believe that these are real. And you have to do that with latent class analysis or other techniques such as cluster analysis, because again, you're not being driven by theory, you're just being driven by what the data are doing. All right, so the next type of egalitarianism is what we call dual responsibility egalitarianism. And in the entire sample, the 17 countries pooled together at the 3 time points, so in the most sort of aggregated version of our data set, let me give you the percentages. Traditionalism, 23% of the total sample. Work egalitarianism, 29%. Dual responsibility, 30%. So these are both, they're all quite large. But again, I'll show you how they're changing over time. So dual responsibility egalitarianism, of course we played around a lot with the names of these to try to figure out what would really convey the sense of the group. This is defined by the dual beliefs that women should be active members of the labor force, and that the family and home comprise essential elements of women's identity. So women have a dual responsibility to work, to contribute to the family income, the household income, but there's a strong element of gender essentialism that women need to do, what they need to do at home. So very strong agreement among people in this class that both husband and wife should contribute to household income, that working mothers can establish just as close a relationship with their children as non-working mothers. However, in other attitudes that really indicate women should work. However, this group has much more what we would call traditional attitudes than the work egalitarians about the necessity of home and family for women's identity, for women's essential identity and fulfillment. So they strongly feel women need a family and children in order to be fulfilled. Strongly agree that while a job is all right, most women really want a home and children. And they do feel, by and large, that staying at home could be fulfilling for women. So it's very pro-work, but there's also this strong strain of gender essentialism related to family. Hannah?
This is one of those ones where you really miss the guys. Like, was there
I
any way of
know.
testing that? Because it's hard to know whether or not it's like traditional family values. Do you know what I mean? Whether it's specifically maternal norms. Like, it would be, is there
It's
any way of
mostly
looking with the
maternal.
data?
It's
Yeah, well,
mostly
that's because you
maternal.
only have data on maternal. You don't have a set of items?
I'll-
Like, is there any other, I wonder if there's any other item where you could test whether these people would also agree
Well,
that men should put their families before their
you're
work? So like, that's a
convincing me.
working class thing.
You're
you know?
convincing me that I should go to the auxiliary results at the end.
Oh, okay.
But these two comments are convincing me with the checks that we did with some of the new attitude questions in the European Values Survey. I'll do that. I'll come back to that. Mhm.
Is this what, like Phyllis Moen has called neo-traditionalist pattern, where you might work do you see these women working part-time? Do you see, evidence of more labor force, that they're employed often, but it's
Yeah.
sometimes secondary to family
Yeah.
responsibilities?
Yeah, that would be consistent. There's not, none of those items asked about full-time versus part-time. But, so I think it includes part-time conceivably. And then the last one is what we call flexible egalitarian. Again, in a different paper, with another co-author, we call this one choice egalitarian. But this is really a kind of variant of egalitarianism. It's the smallest class. It's only 18% of the total pooled sample. This is really the kind of egalitarian position that says that women have choices and that all choices are valid. It's the smallest class. So disagreement by and large that both men and women should contribute to income. High agreement that working mothers can establish just as good a relationship with their children as stay-at-home mothers. But also high agreement that being a housewife can be as fulfilling as paid labor. So, I think to me this sounds very familiar, living in 2016 US. And my anecdotal example is generally the women that I interacted with when my daughter was in Girl Scouts, as she was growing up. And a bunch of these moms, we all get together every few months and have dinner together without our daughters, since our daughters are now all in college. And there's one woman in this bunch who's a stay-at-home mom. She has not worked since the day she got married. She used to be in quite a high position at NPR. She's very, very smart. And of course, she's the volunteer mom. She's the one who ran the PTA while the rest of us were, coming to our jobs during the day and throwing things together for the Girl Scout meeting that we were supposed to be in charge of. Deborah was the one that ran everything. And we love her. We don't talk behind her back and say, it's so terrible, that she only has one kid. It's not like she had 4 kids and had to quit working because of all the childcare demands. But, she made her choices. She seems very happy with them. And then throughout our group of 9 moms, there are those who quit work when their kids were young and have all gone back into the labor force, either part-time or full-time. There are the other ones who worked all the way through, 60-plus hour work weeks or whatever. And there's just this variety, and there's not a tangible disapproval of any of these lifestyles. Now, we're all, of course, completely upper middle class. This is Lexington that we live in, and it's like, very, very upper middle class, very white and Asian. But anyway, that's what I think of when I think of this. Like, women have, viable choices, and by making this choice rather than the other, it doesn't mean that they're not not feminists, or that they're somehow anti-feminist. But this is the smallest class. And unfortunately, we don't have the US in this paper. It is in another paper, but the data are kind of compromised. Okay, so that's what it looks like across all the countries. 3 data points: 1990, 2000, and 2010.
So I have one clarifying question. I don't need to spend too much time explaining the adjectives in front of egalitarianism.
Yeah.
So for instance, in the last one, did you debate about calling it individualism versus flexible egalitarian? And for the third one, dual desire versus dual responsibility. So
This one can't be desire because it's got should.
okay.
women should have the home as a priority. They also should be working. So this one is very hard on women, because it's like, okay, you're out in the labor force, but you can't abandon your essential responsibilities at home. You are the primary caregiver, right? So this one, the responsibility part of it is important. This one, yeah, we didn't think about individualistic. It could be. We thought about flexible or choice. We can still change them because the page proofs are still. We haven't done the page proofs. We just couldn't decide.
The numbers, the percentages that you gave, that was overall, did you find that, and maybe you're going to talk about this,
Yeah,
did
I'm
they
gonna go
cluster
on to this.
by, I'm not going to talk about individual countries, but did you find, okay.
Yeah. So first let me show you the big graph for all countries. So again, we have 3 data points, 1990, 2000, and 2010. And this is why the definitions are so important. First of all, look what's happened to the prevalence of traditional attitudes. And this pattern is visible in every country, although more strongly in some rather than others. So 40% of the total pooled sample in 1990, 40% of individuals believed in these traditional values. And now it's way less than 10%. So that's what people really talk about, right? Okay, well that means we've swung towards egalitarianism. Yeah, we have, but 3 different types. So dual responsibility, which is the one that I just said is hardest on women, that's really gone up. So it's the idea that yes, women should be working, but that doesn't mean that they can cut back or, it doesn't take away from their fundamental responsibilities at home. And then work egalitarian is the most kind of complete prototypical egalitarianism that men and women, again, although we don't have a lot of data in these questions about men, but women and men have equal rights and equal, responsibilities. That one has gone way up. And then this one went up, and it's just not very prevalent. The one that, that I really associate kind of with the upper middle class in the U.S.
Can you talk to the economy behind it at that point?
Pardon?
Can you talk to the economic conditions behind what was happening between 2000 and 2010 for each of the 3 top categories?
Well, you have to look at each country, right? So, the ways to really develop, there are a lot of ways to develop this paper, lots of ways, and one of them is to look at the interaction with the economic conditions in a country. We're not, we didn't get into policy here at all. Obviously, there's a big interplay and set of feedback mechanisms between social policies. And
I'm just thinking though about how you might want to go back to work and with the upward sweep when the economy's bad, and choose not to.
Again, it's highly variable by country. The economic recession in Europe hit countries differentially. I mean, it hit all countries, right, in around here, but differential impact. So I think this is too aggregated to make that kind of. Okay, so here I'm going to show you a few examples, and they probably won't be the ones you want, but again, remind you of the classes. I'm going to show you 2 first Eastern European classes. So these are the, and we have other Eastern European countries in the sample, but Poland and Hungary are quite typical. These are actually the countries where you see the sharpest and strongest decline in traditionalism. And what do you see replacing it? You see dual responsibility, egalitarianism. Women should work, and they should, fulfill their wife and mother responsibilities at home. Right? Very, very strong. And then flexible egalitarianism, there's just almost nothing going on in that group. And work egalitarian, full egalitarianism, typical egalitarianism has gone up, but the most important is this these dual demands on women for work and home. Germany, I picked because it's quite a different pattern. So egalitarianism in our typical kind of way of thinking about it has gone up a lot. Traditionalism wasn't nearly as high as in the Eastern European countries in 1990, but it's gone down as it has in all countries. And again, this flexible egalitarian is almost non-existent. Spain, which is one of my favorite countries because I'm doing a lot of work on it with my postdoc Sienna. Spain, you see a rise in work egalitarianism. We think we see that tremendously in a lot of qualitative data that we have on Spain. They're just a very strong imperative that both men and women should work. A lot of that we think is driven by dreadful, dreadful economic circumstances. So for sure the economy, is having some effect on these probably, and traditionalism down. Italy is rather different. I'm not going to show you Italy, but it's a bit different. Denmark, work egalitarianism, as in the other Nordic countries, very high. Both people work, both people participate at home. So the choice egalitarian is, or flexible egalitarian is always pretty low. I'm going to tell you at the end, or the pseudo end, because then we'll talk about some of these auxiliary analyses. I'm going to tell you maybe some possible implications of all of this. Because here, this is basically a descriptive analysis. We're not predicting a cause from these patterns, right? I mean, an effect, yes?
I know that you didn't want to have a discussion on each of the cases, however.
You can talk about these, but I'm not going to show you the other 12.
I was very curious about Germany because 1990 was just after the unification.
Yeah.
And I know that most of the studies actually take apart East and West.
Yeah.
For good reasons, I believe. So I was just curious, because here the pattern I find really startling. That work egalitarianism is the strongest one. I mean, policies are really dual responsibility.
I know.
And so if people's ideas about that are so strongly different, then I'm really curious if that's an effect from East and West being
It could
put
be.
together.
That's a very good point. We should look at that more.
Yeah.
That's a
Can
very
you
good.
distinguish East and West Germany in your data?
I think so. Yeah.
I would.
I think that's a very good point. I agree with you that it is a bit surprising. You would think that this one would be the more prevalent one. Yeah.
Do you see, I'm not sure I can see that from the data here, but I'm wondering whether we see convergence across countries.
No.
Right? As a one, we don't. No, that's what I,
No.
so, in terms of traditionalism, maybe we do.
Yeah.
It's gone down everywhere, but other than that, you're
Other
saying
than that, we
it's either dual
don't.
responsibility or work egalitarian, and that is very different in different countries.
Yeah, and then this one is just kind of, bumping along
Yeah.
in most countries and not being very prevalent. Yeah, so the part of the analysis that the AJS editors want us to cut is the analysis of convergence, because it uses, or divergence, because it uses another method. Gets very technical. I didn't put that graph in the PowerPoint because we're going to cut it, but you do see a fanning out. So the sort of big takeaways I can get to immediately, of course, decline in traditionalism, right? Absolutely. But that traditionalism hasn't been replaced, as we've seen, by kind of liberal egalitarianism that we typically think of, right? Men and women are equal and they do the same things. Instead, the decline in traditionalism has been replaced by what we see as three quite distinct classes of egalitarianism, and this differs across countries. So by 2010, we do not see countries converging on one of these. They're fanning out. They're continuing to fan out. So, it does open up the possibility of a lot more papers to really explore these things. However, Carly, the data have to be so sound for Carly to work with them. I don't know if I can convince her to, and this is not even related to her dissertation. So I'm not sure. I'm not too sanguine about working with her on more papers, although I would love to. But I mean, you work with her and you know that the results hold water. There's just no ambiguity. So let me talk about, just for a second, the auxiliary results, which a lot of people asked about. Again, in the vein that we don't know much from that 7 gender role attitude questions about expectations for men's roles, and that the European Values Survey has started in recent waves asking about men's roles. So we did a regression analysis on, I wish I had put this table in the PowerPoint now, but anyway. We have a bunch of gender role attitudes that in these later European values waves that do have to do with men's roles. And so what we did was to use our categories, our classes, to see how well they predict those attitudes. And we controlled, of course, in our regression for the sex of the individual. By the way, you really don't see much if you do the analysis separately by sex. There's really not much difference in men's and women's attitudes. Anyway, we had a lot of demographic controls in the equation: level of education, married or not, religion, income level, a lot of demographic variables, and then we had our 4 classes. So here are some of the attitude items that have recently become available that we used as dependent variables. Sharing chores in marriage is important. So, traditional, of course, extremely negative relationship to that. Work egalitarian, extremely strong. Flexible egalitarian, the class that's small, negative relationship to sharing chores. So, if women choose to, it's up to women, but sharing chores is not a big should. Men should take some responsibility for home and children. Of course, very strong negative relationship to traditional attitudes, very strong positive relationship to the work egalitarian attitudes, negative to flexible egalitarian, and so forth. Let's see. Well, I could pass this around, but it's a set of regression equations. But anyway, we did try to use these new gender.
So your comparison is that what it is? Because you're missing one of your categories when you're reading them.
I could be saying that dual responsibility. So the
dual responsibility is your comparison.
We actually looked at the relationship. I'm not sure how she did this, but she looked at the relationship to that one too.
To that one, that was the base.
Yeah.
So that's why it's not.
Yeah.
I have a question sort of about,
Yeah.
For the ones that you just read, all were sort of in the category of should, and I'm curious about this. The flexible one, it seems like there's sort of 2 different ways that I think that people could have fallen into the flexible category. One is if they think that women should have choices about whether or not they work or thing, whereas men sort of assume that they're working. The other one is just that there's no should. And so I'm curious whether any of these questions that are a little to men, whether there are some of them that are not the should ones and where the flexible ones end up on those.
Not really. Sharing chores is important, so that's kind of should, right? Men should take same responsibility for home and children. That's should. Fathers are as suitable to look after children as women are.
Yeah, that sort of the way that I view my flexible, because I think I would consider myself flexible in the sense of I think that it's sort of an individual couple's decision how they manage it. So that one, if it's about this idea of it's up to people to make their own decisions, I would expect them to agree. If it's really just about how they view women's gender roles, then maybe not.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And are all the questions in the survey heteronormative?
Well, we took that as an assumption. Yeah. That's a strong implicit assumption, yeah. Mm-hmm.
When looking at the 4 classes, were you able to disaggregate the data by age? And if so, what do the differences tell us about the direction of these proportions in the next 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, we did look at it by age, and it's not, and we also controlled so that, if populations are becoming younger or older, it's not affecting the proportions. But, traditionalism just declines across the board. But of course, some of the oldest traditionalists are probably dying off.
Right. I'm just curious to know, if the younger generation, if there's a very stark difference in, say, the flexible egalitarian versus the dual.
That's a good question. I can't remember what we found. I should go back and look at that. That would be very interesting. Because we didn't, again, the purpose of this paper, to put it in kind of pejorative terms, is very descriptive. To see what kind of change is going on, how can we model the change itself, are there different types of egalitarianism, but absolutely one of the directions that we can go is, well, who in particular holds these different beliefs? And that's very easy to do with everything we've done with the data, because after all, these gender role attitude classes are made up of individuals. So it's very easy to do, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And just building off that, I was wondering the same thing. If you look at the people who were 30 in 1990, and then if you look at the people who were 30 years old in 1990, and then look at how they responded to the questions 10 years on, that would help you understand if it's just different people or if it's the same generation that's actually changed their perceptions.
Right.
So is it just a different new generation, or is it actually an attitude change in people?
Well, since we have a control for age composition, it is an attitude change overall. Yeah.
Anyone else? Anybody? It's not fair. I keep asking questions, but can I go back to your countries?
Yeah, as long as you don't ask me for others, because I did not know
No. This is actually, and I think this is outside the bounds of the data that you have, but I just sort of, for the sake of being creative, spurred by your ideas. One of the things that I wonder about is whether or not these might, in future research, you could look at whether they're correlated with the gender segregation of labor.
Yeah.
So you might expect, so actually looking at Denmark,
Right.
I thought maybe originally listening to you that dual responsibility would be associated with gender segregation of labor, but I know the Nordic countries are actually highly segregated. So then it made me wonder, well, maybe actually it's easier to be work egalitarian. I mean, it reduces your conflict when your attitudes toward work egalitarianism if men and women do different things at work.
Yeah, everybody works, but they do
everybody
different
works,
things.
but they do different things. So it's all fine. It's all good.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's because the work egalitarianism is by far the highest in the Nordic countries.
But then maybe another way of looking at gender segregation
is equality on paper.
It is equality, right? Well, it's just very right. It's It's globally equal, right? Equal opportunity, assuming no inherent, implicit bias. But
because everybody works, and everybody spends time at home.
But then I was thinking about what about if you could also look at the dispersion of percentage of time in the workplace. So like there, you know what I mean? So that whether or not that you might see more variation between men, like so with the dual responsibility, maybe you don't see this gender segregation of work tasks, is because you're going to get that with the equal attitudes anyways. But maybe what you see is more around this percentage of time in the workforce. So
hours?
Yeah, hours. So maybe the dual responsibility would be like a predictor of more women in part-time labor or something like that, you know, or less security around, you know, the sort of the social construction of part-time work as supplemental as opposed to breadwinning or something like that. Although they agreed pretty high on the breadwinning. The other one, just brainstorming, if you don't mind, tolerate my brainstorming, is social class. Do you have anything on that?
Right. Well, we have income. We have education and income.
Oh, you could combine those. I mean, those would be a pretty. But you just control for them, or do you test for them as, like?
We really didn't. I think in the early iteration of the paper, we did a lot of analyses looking at, kind of individual level determinants of attitudes.
Right, yeah.
But then it was just becoming like a 50-page paper, so we took all of that out. But I think I could persuade Carly to go back to all of that. Again, it's not related to her dissertation, that's the problem.
You might get better results in the U.S. because there's more income inequality and there's broad. I mean, there are more gaps between the. But in the U.S., I mean, there's really interesting stuff around like work, family values, and like blue collar versus white collar, when extreme work being associated with sort of elite professional labor, and how that is likely to influence attitudes toward. So if you're in a job that is relatively hour constrained, you have a job. You're not in an extreme work environment. You can have more generous attitudes toward work family, and maybe toward egalitarian work family attitudes than you can if one or both partners are in extreme work type of situation.
I mean, one of the problems, and this is a very very pedestrian sort of problem to bring up, but once you start doing those kinds of analyses, when you submit the papers to journals, then they say, well, what's the causal order, the causal mechanism, and blah, 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 blah. Right, so.
Right, directionally, what would you do?
Yeah. It's hard, because, I mean, we all know intuitively, right, the gender role attitudes are changing, and institutions, hopefully, are changing, but very slowly, at dinosaur pace. Social policies are changing, so it becomes it's hard. But I do like the comments and value the comments about, unpacking in various ways, unpacking the data. So let me give my favorite implication. As a lot of you know, I work on fertility. And my favorite kind of implication, which is developed in my other paper, is that these gender role classes are predictive of very low fertility or moderate fertility in different countries. So the other paper where the data are a little more compromised in terms of some missing data and some of the attitude questions, that paper actually I talked about in this venue a couple of years ago, and the gender role attitude classes are really important. So let me just tell you the bottom line from that paper. We're still trying to get that paper published, partly because of the messiness of the World Values Survey. And in that paper, we do have more countries. We have the U.S. and East Asia, at least Japan and Korea. So we find that, sorry, it's from my other paper. We find that the straightforward, so to speak, egalitarianism is not predictive of a country's total fertility rate. But the gender role, we found the same 4 classes, which is very exciting because it was for 24 countries, including Japan, Korea, US, Australia, New Zealand, a couple of other countries. And we found the same 4 classes, which is great. And it's 1990 to 2010, only using the World Values Survey. But this ideology of the dual responsibility, let's go back to that. So the one that's, become so prevalent in the Eastern European countries, those are the ones that are shown here, is negatively related to total fertility, right? Which makes sense. Because women need to be working, but their role as mothers is also very important. And so how do they do both? They do both by having one child instead of 2 or 3. Traditionalism, after we control for many things, is not doesn't predict fertility, total fertility rate, one way or another. But this dual kind of burden of work and family, predictably, is depressing fertility in a lot of countries.
So just to clarify, is it the individual's
No.
class predicts her fertility,
No.
or no?
Total fertility of the country.
The countries with higher dual responsibility.
Higher proportionate, of the population. So a big problem with that paper is, lo and behold, we are claiming causality, and it's with aggregate data. So we've had the paper rejected. And we redo it, and we send it back, to another journal. And what we get is, these ideas are fantastic, but, how about this thing, and this thing, and this thing, and the methods? So, it's an aggregate analysis. So we look at changes in the total fertility rate of a country over time, and then we lag the other variables. And labor market regulation, that really makes it, such as in Spain, Italy, the southern European countries, and Japan, labor market regulations that really prioritize male breadwinners, by protecting their jobs, low fertility. Because it's very hard for women to get into the labor market and stay in the labor market, and it's also very hard for young men to get a toehold in the labor market when economic recession hits. And we do find an interesting interaction between gender role ideology and the structure of the labor market, which of course I love since I study labor markets.
What is your interaction?
The interaction is between flexible egalitarianism. Hold on. It's a negative interaction between flexible egalitarianism, which is giving women these choices, and very rigid labor markets, which is not giving them choices. So the flexible egalitarianism or choice egalitarianism we argue, doesn't really help women if the labor market rigidities are too strong. Because women still have to choose between work or home. So even though norms are flexible, for a woman, say in Japan, if she enters the career track, she can't come back.
You're one or the other.
It's one or the other. It's black or white. Yeah. Okay, Cole?
Maybe we have talked about this, but I'm a little bit confused with this flexible egalitarianism, because there has to be a kind of a condition to be able to be flexible.
That's right.
For the choice. Right?
That's right.
So you
so
said
class
that
is very
it
much
is negatively related to this men's role in having. It was negatively related to some of the East European survey about men's, being more active. Yeah. I might have a kind of a misstep.
Yeah, it's not.
But with this condition, compounded with this flexibility, how can we kind of make this your argument about this?
With which condition compounded?
Yeah, that you have to have kind of an economic stability to be flexible, to have a choice.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, these are this is country level.
Yeah.
I didn't show anything by social class, so I totally agree. It's heavily determined or predicted by social
but
class.
Even on an individual level, you've got to have this conditions.
Right. By social class
Yeah.
membership. I mean, your husband has to.
But you said that you have control with this education and income level.
Well, those are the regressions that I didn't show all of you, but it's across all countries, and it does control.
Interesting. Did you control for employment status as well, or did you have aggregate mean for the country, like the proportion of women
No.
working?
No, we didn't use any aggregate means, it's all individual level.
There was no data on status.
Well, what do you mean by employment status?
As a working mother or a
Full-time,
working woman, my answers to that versus like a sustained. Who already made choices.
I think there's employment, working or non-working. I'm not sure if the problem with the World Values Survey and to some extent European values is the demographic variables are pretty bad. The attitude variables, all the emphasis in the World Values Survey, as we know, is on attitudes about everything in the world, and the demographic variables are just bad. I mean, there aren't very many of them. Income is missing for many, many people. It makes it really hard to do analysis of determinants of attitudes. You can look at what attitudes are correlated with what, but it's just not set up very well to do, look at sociodemographic characteristics.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this kind of core idea that you have of essentialism. And, I'm connecting this to a recent piece I saw. The British Airways is now requiring the women to wear skirts. Did you see?
No.
So,
Well, that's kind of going back, isn't it?
Well,
only kind of.
And, for the ones who are hired before a certain date, it's grandfathered in that they can still wear pants.
Why? Why are you doing that?
So to me, this kind of rollback of women's rights and this concept of essentialism that you've come up with. I mean, I realize that this survey is not everything that there is in the world that would indicate what's really going on.
But gender essentialism is very, very strong, And in our qualitative data in the low fertility study that I have, we see, we embedded in these in-depth interviews that we did in 5 countries, many world values survey questions. And when you listen to individuals, you realize how inconsistent almost everybody's beliefs are, right? So you hear women, I mean, it's true everywhere, and it's true for us in this room, I'm sure, but you hear a lot of people saying, a lot of women saying, yes, I want to, continue working. But then you get to, well, a working mother can establish just as warm and secure a relationship with her child as a non-working mother. Yes. And then you get to the question, well, how about for children under 3 years old? And people start hemming and hawing and saying somebody should be at home. Well, guess who the someone is going to be? There's no choice here. It's the woman, right? So people are very internally inconsistent, but gender essentialism is alive and well. It doesn't show up like men make better business executives than women. That's a world values question that we asked in our in-depth surveys. I mean, 90% of people say that's baloney. But then some people invoke their own type of gender essentialism and say, well, women are better decision makers. Women are actually better than men are as executives because da-da-da-da-da-da. So there's a lot of gender essentialism. And sometimes it conflicts with egalitarianism and sometimes it doesn't. But it's a different dimension.
This dual responsibility, egalitarianism, what you just talked about was descriptive. Women do make better, or women are better decision makers as opposed to women should be. Is there a is it the dual? I was hearing you say earlier that the dual has a strong
I'm
should
not correlating it
element
with the dual. This is much more of an anecdote from our qualitative study, but we haven't. No, we're not.
But the should is embedded in the dual responsibility notion.
Should work, but they should still be the primary
right.
person at home. Yeah, absolutely. So it's really this one where choice is, women have choices, have broad choices, and should be.
So is there anywhere the descriptive though? It's not that women should be better negotiators, but my observation or my experience is women are, not mine, but the descriptive that there is a difference between men and women as opposed to the normative that there should be a difference between men and women, is that in there anywhere?
Well, again, we didn't use questions such as the business executives one in
Right,
this paper,
okay.
but that question in the World Values Survey is it's not a normative statement. It's men make better business executives than women. So it is what is the
Right.
reality that you believe? So that's a good example of a question it's not normative. It's simply what is your belief about this?
So it could have an essentialism element, but not a normative one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a normative one.
But it is an interesting question whether they're correlated. I mean, it's totally beyond your paper.
Yeah.
But is the should and the descriptive
Right.
correlated? Of course, no causality either way, we can't say, but it is an interesting question. Maybe they're not.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Mary, thank you so much. I wanted to make sure I also acknowledge the Weatherhead Center
Oh, yes.
for
We have to do that.
consulting and kind of advertising our not so new initiative anymore that Mary is spearheading, the Weatherhead Initiative on Gender Inequality that a number of us across the university are involved in, and is kind of really quite exciting for us to work across disciplines.
Yeah, and we're just getting the website up
Mhm.
finally, and I'm looking at Carrie because I couldn't hire her to help me. Although I think the WAP website is the most beautiful one at the university. It's amazing. But we just got our website up, and we have funding for graduate students and undergraduates, and assistant and associate professors for research. So. And we'll talk to each other a lot more once things get really off the ground. So, yeah, thank you very much.
And I just also want to say that we're having an information session today at 4:15 for any students who are looking for summer internship funding. If you're doing a gender-focused project, please come join us this room at 4:15. See you there.
And next week we have Katie Baldiga-Kaufman in the seminar, and she's going to look at a question that I imagine some of you are interested in, the effect of sponsorship. So there's lots of rumor, but actually not that much good experimental evidence on what is the impact of having a sponsor. And she ran an experiment trying to see what the impact of sponsorship is on men and women. So we might see some of you next week. Thanks all for coming.